Welcome to the Kerrville Bible Church podcast, where we seek to encourage and equip you for the work of ministry by taking a pastoral look at a variety of biblical and theological topics. Stay tuned until the end of the episode to learn how you can submit a question for us to answer on the podcast. Welcome back to the Kerrville Bible Church Pastors Podcast. My name is Toby Baxley, and I am your host, joined as always by Scott Christensen, Chris McKnight, Murray Van Gundy, and we're going to talk today about a topic that really doesn't affect us personally, but probably will affect you wretches, and that is the problem of anger and bitterness toward maybe a spouse, maybe children, parents. And so I'll let you guys talk. I mean, I think you guys struggle with this more than I do, but just let you guys kind of take off on that and kind of where does this come from, and what can we do about it?
Are you directing that question
to
any
I was joking, by the way.
In particular, you've been joking almost the entire time.
Yeah. My name actually is Toby.
That's true.
The only true thing I've said.
Well, where does it come from? It comes from the flesh. It comes from the world. It comes from the devil. It's part of our unredeemed flesh that we have to do battle with. And so I suggested the topic today as a kind of a topic of, okay, we all have experienced on either side of the anger in marriage, the anger in parenting. It's very relevant. It's very real. It's daily. It's hourly. And so, my ultimate hope in this and bringing it up was not only to, I guess talk about the problem, and there's no shortage of conviction that we can all come under. I mean, with this, we've been talking about this for several minutes now before the podcast, and we've all had conviction. We've all had confession in our time of prayer, right? So it's a very real thing, and but that's part of it. But also, my real heart's desire is just how do we help people? How do we help people get the upper hand? How do we help people to learn some new behaviors and unlearn some old behaviors, and put off and put on, and kind of have some more victory? I do battle with this besetting sin or this raging temptation as it is. Where does it come from? It comes from our unredeemed flesh. It comes from our hearts. And what's in the heart is going to come out, some way, some form. It's going to come out. But one of the things I guess I want to start with is just the two options you have with anger that are kind of unhelpful, sinful options. And we all have probably done both of them many times. One option is to erupt. You hold it in. You're the volcano that's building, and then finally it erupts. And the lava goes all over everybody, and there's the outburst, the wrath, the throwing things, hitting things, yelling, screaming, cussing, whatever it looks like when it erupts, the ventilation of anger. And then in that situation, you're taking all that anger and you're aiming it at, generally speaking, another person. Maybe an object that represents that person, but it's generally speaking a person that you're angry with, and that's where the anger gets unleashed.
I think when you say that, I think of that movie Inside Out. I don't know if anybody's seen that movie, where you have the different emotional characters inside the mind. You get the anger character, and whenever he gets really angry, just fire spews out of his mouth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I remember. I saw the previews to that movie.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about now. The other one is the opposite of that, is to internalize the anger, and that's the person that becomes takes it all inward, seething, kind of the bitterness, the clamming up. You can either outburst or clam up, and these are the two sinful extremes that we tend to fall into. That's not the proper way to handle anger. Both of them are sinful. They're equally sinful. Ephesians 4 says, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger," which implies it's sinful to clam up and turn it inward. And what's going to happen inevitably is health problems. It's the same kind of problems that come with unforgiveness. And you think you're punishing the other person, you're not forgiving, but you're actually punishing yourself. And you start having things like colitis and ulcers and tension headaches and high blood pressure and all kinds of things start happening to your body physically because you've internalized this almost like a poison, and it hasn't been properly dealt with.
What's interesting too is I think that when people don't deal with anger, and a lot of times anger can come from the most insignificant incident that you took offense at or felt unjustly treated. But then when you don't deal with it, what happens is it builds bitterness, and then the problem gets expanded in your mind, and then it just sort of seeps into other feelings of injustice and offenses, to the point where you're just building bitterness toward that person, or just generally speaking, with everything that happens to you because you don't deal with it.
Yeah. I think it's important too to note that the lack of hot emotion is not an indication of a lack of anger. I think there are different kinds of anger that we can fall into, and I'm just looking back at this Ed Welch book that we had as the book of the month back, I think, in July, and I sold like 50 copies of this thing in 2 weeks.
What's the title of the book?
It's called A Small Book About a Big Problem. And he talks about different kinds of anger, covert anger, which is like sarcasm, just grumbling and complaining. Gossip is covert anger, feeling annoyed or frustrated, and that smoldering kind of thing is covert. Cold anger is pretty damaging too. The silent treatment, withdrawal, indifference, just being detached and keeping score. And then you've got the hot anger, which a lot of people are like, well, if I don't have hot anger, then I must be okay. But that's the jealousy, wrath, making war, quarreling, explosions of rage, things like that. And so I think it's beyond what we can see. Kind of like all sin, there's things under the surface that we need to deal with.
And the danger with the covert anger, the internalizing the anger, is it can seem like I have a lot of self-control. I'm exercising a lot of self-control. I don't ventilate. I don't let it out, and yet it's sinful. But it can be seen as even self-righteous and look at me, And there's danger in that for sure, right? Because then you got pride seeps in there. So I think at the heart of the matter is it's a condition of the heart on both sides. And so we got to deal with the root of the issue, which is inside the heart, and how to deal with that. What do we do with the real problem of anger? That's a real problem, right? We're all agreeing that
sinful anger.
Yeah,
So
sinful anger.
This is where it's tricky, right? Because there is a such thing as righteous indignation and righteous anger. Mm-hmm. Jesus was angry. God has anger towards sin, and Psalm 7, God is angry with the wicked every day. Psalm 7:11. And so anger is not always sin. It would be easier, I think, if we had this just clear, line in the sand. Because there are things that are always sin, right? But anger isn't one of those things. And so I've got this little J. Adams, What Do You Do When Anger Gets the Upper Hand, little pamphlet that's in our biblical counseling rack here at the church, and was reading through that before today. And he really talks about how anger is an emotion that God gives us. And the issue is we got to learn how to properly express it. And it's neither of the things I talked about earlier, but to properly express anger is to do it in self-control, and to aim the anger at the problem and not another person. Not ourselves, not another person, but the actual problem. Mm-hmm. And then that's where you get into a godly response to anger of, I'm going to say what I say, do what I do, under control, led by the Spirit, and I'm not going to attack another person. I don't want to harm them. I'm actually have their highest interest in mind, and so I'm aiming this at the actual problem, which ultimately is always going to be, sin or the devil.
Right.
You quoted that verse. We don't wrestle with each other. It's with principalities and powers. And So anyway, I think that part's helpful. I wish his little pamphlet actually said more about this, but in a nutshell, he says we must learn how to release anger under control.
Yeah. And, he pointed out in that pamphlet that sometimes you hear people say, well, I just can't control my anger. It just sort of comes out of me, and I have no control over it. So, how do I handle that? And of course, he points out that that's just simply not true. It depends on the circumstance. What was the illustration used? You're yelling at your kids and whatnot, and then someone calls who happens to be the chair of the gossip committee, and the last person that you ever want to know about your anger, and you're like, "Oh, hi, how you doing? Nice to see you." When moments before you were spewing flames out at your children or whatever. So it shows that we can control our anger. And so the question is, why do we not control it in all situations?
Yeah, because we can get away with it. I think one of the things he talks about, very convicting, he says, isn't it strange, businessman, that you think it's more important to control your temper with your boss than with your wife? And his point that he makes is a Christian, and that's who he's addressing in this, a Christian can control, you can. You can. That's what the Bible tells us. If we lose that, we lose everything. Mm-hmm. You can be in control. You can exercise self-control. The reason you don't is because when you get angry with the people you get angry with, it's because you can get away with it. And you don't do it at work. You control yourself at work because you lose your job. Mm-hmm. The lady in the illustration doesn't do it with the phone call because that's the last person she wants to know that she's lost it with her kids. And so she instantly brings herself under control.
Yeah.
And so it ends up being with our spouse and our kids primarily, right? Everybody nods in approval. It's our spouse and our kids where we can say things and do things ultimately because we know in the back of our mind, I can get away with this.
Yeah.
And we would talk to our kids and we would talk to our spouses in ways we would never, ever, ever talk to even a total stranger, Yeah.
You think there's no consequences, right. Like I can speak in an angry way to my wife because I know she's not going to divorce me. And, whereas you could, you risk speaking, spewing anger toward your boss, you're going to lose your job.
Right.
And so it's a matter of what do you value? I think you talked about, do you value your marriage less than you value your job? And, in your relationships that are closest to you. And so it's a matter, Murray, you talked about the heart, we have to, anger often, reveals some of the idols of our heart and the priorities that we take most seriously in our lives. And they're not always the right priorities.
Right. Yeah, I think anger does, it pokes on our idols a lot of times, especially with kids, when they do something that is discipline worthy, we're more likely to punish them for inconveniencing us than we are to train them in righteousness. And I think about what Paul wrote to the Ephesian church about fathers not exasperating your kids, not provoking them to anger, but teaching them, but raising them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And so there's kind of this, it's sort of an either or thing. Either you're going to lash out at them and provoke them to anger, or you're going to teach them. And so we're more likely to be inconvenienced and punish them for inconveniencing us than to train them in a way that pleases the Lord.
It's also in those moments we have forgotten what our actual calling is as fathers and mothers and parents. It's the put off, put on. Yeah, this is inconveniencing me, but wait a minute, what am I actually here for?
Right.
I'm not here to watch this football game or read this newspaper or read this book or check this thing on my phone. That's not why I exist. I'm here to train this child up in the way he should go. I mean, this is actually my calling, and so I think in those moments when we get upset because they have interrupted something, they've inconvenienced us, they've ruined our day, they've made us mad, all those lies that we tell ourselves, we're actually forgetting that, like, next to loving God and loving my wife, this is like my highest calling. Yeah. This is, in a sense, this is why I exist right now in this person's life. how can you say it? You've actually forgotten your job.
Yeah.
Paul Tripp. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, it takes an incredible amount of work and effort to deal with discipline issues as a parent.
Right.
And so when you feel inconvenienced and typically, you lash out in anger or you spank a child in anger and, because it's the expedient thing to do. And, I always learned as a parent that the best moments of discipline were when I made, my disobedient son, I had 4 sons, go to their room, and then I go to my room because I need to deal with my own heart. I need to deal with my own attitude and motives before I go and deal with them. And oftentimes that meant confessing my own frustration and anger, to the Lord and getting control of myself so that I could go and objectively deal with the issue at hand, because they may have done something that deserved punishment, that deserved discipline.
Right.
But if you discipline a child in anger, typically you're going to over-discipline them so that the punishment is greater than the offense. And that can cause anger in your children. That's one way that fathers particularly can exasperate their children in anger.
I like I think that pamphlet talked something about bridling ourselves, bridling our anger.
Yes.
And the idea of a bit and bridle for a horse is to bring it under submission. Right. So, what submission to the authority of Christ, to his will and ways. And, I'm going back to, parenting. I really like what Paul Tripp talked about in his parenting book of the idea of ownership versus stewardship. And a lot of us,
That's huge.
It is. It's huge. And a lot of us discipline our kids as owners.
Right.
You have failed me.
Made me look bad.
You made me look bad rather
me.
than I am in charge of I am tasked with bringing you up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, because ultimately you don't belong to me, you belong to Him. And so we'll overdo it,
Well, that's where the feelings get hurt. That's where we start taking offense.
Right.
We start making it about us. We start taking our kids' sin. We make it about us instead of about God.
Yeah.
And
Right.
another way to say that, steward versus ownership is I'm an agent. I'm a manager. I'm an agent in between my kids and God for a season.
Right.
I represent Him to them, and then I pray on their behalf to Him.
right.
And so where we get in trouble as parents is when we let their sin, where we think it's against us primarily, where we make too much of ourselves when their sin is ultimately against God. And we're here to represent what's true and right, to discipline where appropriate, to point in the right direction, but ultimately we don't control their responses, we don't control their heart, we don't control their conversion. All of those things are out of our hands. And so if we've done our job of being a faithful agent, representing God to our kids and representing our kids back to God in prayer, we've done our job.
Right.
And what they do with it at that point is, up to them. But
And
it's
there's no guarantees there.
no
either.
guarantees. And it's the, I think where the real anger starts to come is all of this, that key point, that issue of ownership. Parents have to detach themselves a couple of degrees emotionally from their kids and their kids' sin. You've got to have a little bit of objective separation from that, and that's hard. It takes it's a mental massive war to keep that thought always on the forefront of your mind.
Well, it's like if your kid had their friend over and they both committed the same offense, how would you discipline, to whatever degree,
That's a good illustration.
that other kid? Let's say the parent said, "Hey, when my kid's at your house, just so you know, like they're under your authority, blah blah blah." Well, you're gonna react differently to that your kid's friend versus your own kid, right? And so, and why? Why would we do that? Because it's what you're saying, Toby, this ownership versus stewardship. Because I'm a steward of my son's friend when they're in my home, right? But then I have this ownership over my own kid that I'm going to overreact or, whatever. And then I think there is an underlying, of course, we're talking primarily about Christians who are struggling with anger. We're not talking about just anger of the world. We're talking about Christians. But we also, there's a history. There's a history of how we were raised by our own parents.
Sure.
Possibly how our fathers treated us and how their fathers treated them, and how our coaches treated us, and were we bullied in school or not bullied? Were we the bully in school? There's so many layers to this.
Yeah.
And that's why it really gets down to the heart. It's a heart issue, and Lord, search my heart. Search my heart, and why do I react this way to my wife? Why do I react this way to my son or my daughter?
Right.
And why am I so quick to anger and I don't show self-control, or I don't do what you said, Scott? Because I remember, gosh, before having kids, I remember everyone talking about how you discipline, what was it? Dobbs. Who's Dobbs?
Dobson.
Dobson.
Yeah, James Dobson.
Dr. James Dobson, right? And you discipline them by telling them this hurts you more than it hurts me, and I'm praying for you, and we take a little moment to go through this, and then we're going to hug you after I spank you when you're crying. And I'm like, oh man, that's awesome.
You read all those books before?
Oh my gosh, wooden spoons flying to my house, man. Broken spoons, and I loved and love my kids a lot,
Right.
and yet. I couldn't get that spoon fast enough. We had them in our glove compartment. We had them in the nightstand in the kitchen. Ella will tell you, oh yeah, they broke about 4 or 5 spoons.
You're looking for like a boat paddle, so you can just hit them from across.
Well,
the room.
I want to be able to swing this 10-foot pole, just get them all at the same time. And so it's just crazy. And I know the Lord, and I love the Lord, and I love my kids,
Right.
and yet, really, Murray, that's what comes out.
Yeah.
You've got and crazy.
So verse, can I throw out a verse that's helped me in this battle for
Please.
sure? Yeah. James 1:19 and 20, especially verse 20. This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. So he doesn't say never get angry, just like Paul in Ephesians.
Yeah.
Slow to anger, slow to anger. Why? Verse 20. This is the verse that's really, really helped me. For the anger of man, the anger of Chris, does not achieve the righteousness of God. It doesn't achieve, it doesn't produce, it doesn't get you there. And we talked about earlier, there is a righteous anger, but 99% of our anger isn't righteous.
Right.
It's such a fine line, and we're rarely on that side. And this is a verse just constantly, really just to memorize this verse, and just as you're tempted, tell yourself, this does not achieve the righteousness of God.
And unpack that just a little bit. What is it? How does it start? Be quick to hear or quick to listen, right? So what does that do, right? When our kids, that'll diffuse the situation maybe even a little bit. Listen to what's going on. The two of them are fighting or whatever. Certainly our spouses.
Listen, right.
Listen.
Right.
Listen.
Right.
And then slow to speak, right? So there's some self-control in there. Kind of what Scott's saying is I had to just say, okay, go to your room and go to your own. You went to your own room to really, okay, Lord. And then
take a big, deep breath.
Oh my gosh, all that this looks great on paper. That takes a lot of, and I think in our own personal relationship with Christ, as we pursue Christ, we really pursue His Word, and we really want to be filled with the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit in our lives. And the more we do that as individual people, then we really do find ourselves in a situation where the Holy Spirit really is checking us and saying, go to your own room, Scott, and we can do it, right? But then it is directly related to our relationship with Christ.
Let me throw something I was going to say a minute ago that ties us back to last week, because there are some people that are just angry people. And so we've been talking about spouses or children, and maybe you just get angry with your children and not your spouse, and that's really only where your problem is. But there are other people that are just angry. They're just angry. They're just seething, angry, upset with the world, upset with everybody. And so it's probably all of the above. Mm-hmm. And I think it ties back to last week's discussion.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of cases, people who, and maybe they haven't thought this through, and we're not talking about psychoanalysis, but I think people who are just angry people, perhaps at the root of that, they're angry at God. Mm-hmm. They're angry at God about something, and they haven't really dealt with God's sovereignty. They haven't dealt with God's goodness in their life, whatever it might be. And so I think there is this connection to last week's topic. Is it ever right to be angry at God? And this might be that might be the underlying problem. You might need to get right to the root of all of your anger is that you are really raging against God.
Yeah, you got a raw deal from
You
God.
got some
from
kind
God.
of raw deal, and
Yeah.
everybody's going to know about it, and everybody's going to feel it.
Yeah.
You know, when I first started reading this book, this Ed Welch book that I mentioned, I think Melissa was listening to a podcast. I don't know if it was through the ACBC, the Biblical Counseling outfit, and she said that they said that anger, and I think, anger is misplaced lament, and I think that's exactly what you're talking about. When we're angry, what we should be, like David, like you mentioned last week, saying, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" I feel like I've been offended somehow by God, and I want to take that to God to remember His goodness, to not take it out on Him, but to take it to Him,
Right.
so that I don't take it out on everybody else.
As grief instead of anger, as
Yeah.
lament,
As lament instead of anger.
instead of hate and rage.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's worth saying. So,
I think I think
massive
it's
topic.
Yeah, it is. I think we could talk about this in the sense of anger toward our kids, toward our spouses, and we haven't really even mentioned spouses yet. But the Bible definitely has some things to say about that. And then even parents. I think what's going on, maybe one of many things, is that we are asking of them more than they can provide. Mm-hmm. We are asking them to be something that only Jesus can be for us.
Right.
Some sort of comfort,
Right.
some sort of security. And I mean, when we look to something else besides God for comfort and security, significance, that's idolatry. Joy. Yeah. The Bible defines that as idolatry, a thing, making good things something that's ultimate. Like, I have to have that.
Yeah.
And let me put one more on that list, because I think a lot of men, not just men, women too, it's the control issue. So many times anger is triggered by not being in control, and we're control freaks, and we want to be in control. We want to be in control of things and people around us and traffic and kids and my spouse's response, and that's an idol. It's just, and so when that gets undermined, and our kids, when they start expressing their own sinful wills. We had a little video the other day of our granddaughter, and in the background, Mary was going, "No, Hattie, no, Hattie," and that's like the first time. I was like, "Oh man, we're going to hear that about 1 million times in the next few years," because here she's 14 months old, she's mobile, she's starting to get into things, but when that will starts getting expressed, and we start seeing that we're not in control, we're at a fork in the road, right? Mm-hmm. One fork is ramp it up, use anger to be in control. The other fork is, a righteous path.
And I have yet to meet a parent who doesn't want the world to see that their kid is different and that their parenting style is better, right? Not one, like,
bingo.
Look how we're doing it. Like, no, we're not going to, and it fails every time. Like, this has got to be what y'all are looking forward to as grandparents is, man, we get to love them. It's just pure grace. You get to show pure grace, man. You get to just love them, and then...
But I'm going to be asking for some discipline.
Yeah, I don't see you doing it, though. You ain't spanking no Hattie. You ain't spanking no Hattie. No way. No way, Jose. You mark my words right here. There ain't no way.
She's going to bat her eyes at you, and you're going to melt.
There ain't no way. She's like...
she already owns us. It's already done.
Yeah. That's good.
So, I think you talked about this, is that a root of anger is also maybe inordinate desires. So desires aren't bad, right? Mm-hmm. They're not bad, but when we elevate those desires to maybe needs, when we elevate wants to needs, then things start to go haywire. And then when we elevate needs to demands, we're putting those demands on other people, and they can't possibly meet
Yeah.
all of those requirements that we have either stated or are kind of unwritten, our own unwritten rules.
So and it all goes back to
help?
Thinking of ourselves as being the center of the universe, and everyone is there, for me, instead of placing God at the center of our thinking and of who we are. It's all about our own personal glory as opposed to the glory of God.
Yeah. But Paul had a lot to say. I mean, you're asking where's the help? Yeah. Paul, as far as husbands and wives go, stated very simply, and you mentioned this earlier, husbands, love your wives and don't be embittered against them. There's kind of an either or there. You're either loving them or you're angry. You're loving them or you're embittered against them. Peter said, live with your wife in an understanding way. And so, as fellow heirs of the grace of life, right? We're not above them. Our husbands are not above our wives. We're co-heirs. And so, it's kind of there's that either or thing. Either you're loving them, you're living with them in an understanding way, or your prayers are going to be hindered, So, love and understand. But most of the time we want to be served and we want to be understood. And that's where we have a demand and a need to be understood.
It's always the putting off, putting on is the paradigm for all sanctification. So the help comes from, don't stop, repent, see it as sin, stop doing it. You are in control of your tongue. You are in control of your behavior. You can unlearn and learn. And there are examples of life that we've alluded to that show us that, yes, in fact, we are very much under control when we want to be. Mm-hmm. And if we're motivated enough and the consequences are apparent, mm-hmm. we will get ourselves under control. So maybe we can end this way with the end of Ephesians 4, which is a whole litany of put off, put on sort of things. And Paul says, let all bitterness and wrath, so bitterness is that internal attitude, that's the seething, that's the root. Let that, the wrath is the outburst, that's the physical, verbal outburst. And anger and clamor, that's a word that implies noise, banging of pots and pans, whatever. Ooh, Mom, I'm staying out of the kitchen. Mom is not happy, whatever. And slander. And he puts slander in the category of anger, right? Slander is tearing down another person's character, reputation.
You stupid little kid.
Speaking badly about somebody.
Making a false accusation.
False accusation. It's all part and parcel of the same thing. Let it be put away from you. Put it away. So there is this old Bob Newhart joke, stop it. There is a putting away, along with all malice. That's a hateful attitude towards somebody. So really getting to the heart here in a lot of these sins. Okay, well, that's great. But that's only half of the equation. That's only half the solution. The next half is the next verse. Be kind to one another. You got to replace all of this stuff with something else. Be kind to one another. Tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you.
And boy, that last part is really important because, we are going to fail. And when we fail, we've got to be prepared to confess and to seek forgiveness from spouse, children, parents.
The best antidote against anger is really humility. Right. It's really recognizing I'm a wretch, I'm a sinner, God's forgiven me. The only person that's right to be angry is God with me. Mm-hmm. And if I can keep that in the forefront of my mind, now I move through life thinking, and that's what I have to do with myself. When I feel anger coming up, there's always pride alongside of it and self-righteousness. And I've got to just stop and just get back to what God has forgiven and try to walk in humility and fight the battle at that level of the heart. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. That is a good place to close today. And I hope this has been encouraging to you. I hope it's given you something to think about in your struggle with anger. And Lord willing, we will be back next week with another new episode. Chris, would you close us in prayer?
I will. God of heaven and earth, thank you for the grace of forgiveness for our sinful anger that we've all experienced and committed. Thank you that when we confess our sins, you are faithful and you are just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all anger, all sinful anger. I'll just plug that in. Lord, thank you for that. Thank you for these words. We pray that we'd be able to take them to heart. We pray that you'd give us increasing measures of victory in this arena of our life. Even today, we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.
Thanks for listening to the Kerrville Bible Church podcast. In future episodes, we would like to answer your biblical, theological, or pastoral questions. Send them to us via email at questions@kerrvillebiblechurch.org or leave us a text or voicemail at 830-321-0349.